beaten by
So
technology.
what are we talking about?
All right,
You love people up in the hills too?
just a little.
Okay.
Just a little.
Leading at Southeast
I'm gonna begin with that because that's what was on there, and I'm not gonna talk about the world system of Highland Peru, which is the title that you had me down for in the beginning. And, I wanna, first I wanna thank you for this fantastic meeting, and it's great to see all these people that I haven't seen in such a long time, and I hope this continues. Until I die, which will probably be in a couple of weeks. But keep up the good work. Like I think it's a fantastic idea. It's really important, and we should all be working on this stuff. And these meetings are extremely important because, as we said, I think the first meetings at the ISA. Why did people go to the ISA? I mean, after all, it's a bunch of Mormons. It was to get out of their departments, out of their silos, out of their slots, and to talk about important stuff that wasn't confined by departmental subject matter divisions. And it looks like it's still the same. And I like that. You can be speculative, you can make mistakes, you can be right or wrong, and people can tear the crap out of you, and it's really good. And it ends with a barbecue, right? I'm going to talk about two things, and it's a little bit about my own experience in all of this. The first has to do with the whole question of boundaries, and Chris's paper is about systemic boundaries. Within the systemic boundaries seen from the outside, there are internal boundaries which get created, practiced, and reproduced. I'm not going to talk about what makes systemness, but I think everyone's gone through it, and it's very much about the whole issue of reproduction, where different parts of, could say, different units in a world are connected in such a way that they become dependent on one another for their own social reproduction, then I think we can talk about systemness. And it comes out in various ways, and we can talk about the various ways. But I'm going to stick to that now because I haven't got time to say anything else. About this, my interest in this is to some extent James Scott, who's a real nice guy, but he wrote a book which is really ridiculous. And we've had a big debate about it, and a lot of people have attacked him for it. It's about this place called Zumia, which was invented by a historian, geographer from the University of Amsterdam, named Van Schendel, as late as 2003. And it is about a zone, if you can see it here on the map, can you see it? Which covers a gigantic area, which is basically the highlands of Southeast Asia into northern Southeast Asia and even China, up to Tibet. And that's because the word Zo, it means highland peoples, basically. And it's not a real area, it never was, but it's been used by a certain number of people to try to say that these people who live in these areas, because they are not states, but they are related to states, are on the peripheries of states, are somehow against the state. In most cases, if you get down to the details, they're against the states which they are trying to get away from, but they're very busy with their own state projects. And most of these areas have contained states and statelets in one period or another, and some of them are pretty expansionist, especially when things get bad in the valley states. Then they expand down and take over. I would note that, for example, the first people that I ever studied, which were the Kachin of Highland Burma, were never conquered by the British. They lost every single battle that they fought with them. And then they got them into their own colonial military apparatus. There are other ways to defeat them, of course, and they did that. But I don't want to talk about that now either. In any case, so this area is a zone. It's an interstitial zone. It's between states, you could say. It is a buffer zone in certain senses also, although not completely, although there are Chinese statelets and states which move down. It's a zone of gigantic trade. The largest silver mines in China were in fact in Burma, and they were run by a group which today is quite egalitarian called the Wa. Headhunters, and they became headhunters, but formerly were quite hierarchical. And the silver mine is a gigantic area in upper Burma, which people haven't studied, but which is really quite interesting. One of my points is that we have to see these things always on a continuum. And that's what I'm going to be talking about, is that there is a continuum of, you could say, expansion and contraction of larger systems and boundedness and transformation of the social orders which are contained within those processes, which are, in a certain sense, autonomous because you can't deduce one from the other. But if you start at the lower level of the social orders, you can deduce one social order from another, I think, if you're a good structuralist. And so I'm going to play that game. That is, to some extent, related to the issue of modularity. I really like that idea of networks and modularity, and the question of integration. Because all of this is about different kinds of integration into larger units and disintegration of those units, which I think is a way of understanding an awful lot of these processes. You get that?
Yeah.
Are you awake?
Yep. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Am I awake? Okay, so let's forget about Zumia because it's not worth it. One of the aspects of this Zumia thing has to do with the way in which certain of these societies, for example in northern Laos, in Burma and other places, were incorporated into the larger commercial valley states, which were themselves incorporated into the European world system. And I'm talking about, let's say, from 1500 on. And that is that if they were largely independent, large scale, you could say, well, larger or smaller scale, aggressive states that controlled trade routes and took tribute from traders and from larger states, if they could, suddenly began to be connected in a different way. And you can see it in the transformation of the social orders themselves, that the chiefs who were war chiefs became people dependent on prestige goods. They became monopolists of trade goods that were coming from the outside, and which were used internally for bride price, debt payments, and so on and so forth. They became almost a kind of money on the inside. And these became what you might call, in the jargon, supply zone peripheries to the larger states. But that could go back and forth, depending on what was going on in the expansion and contraction of those larger systems. So I'm going to try to, I hope I got everything on here. Oh my God, this thing. Oh, there it is. Okay. Have I got this one? Here. Okay. So, a very old thing that I used to have, which is kind of close to some of the stuff that's been discussed today, if it comes up, is that. All right. This is a very reduced schematic model of global systemic relationships, in which you have centers, you have semi-peripheries, you have expansionist structures, and these are those here. Sometimes they're called barbarians, but they're just expansionist structures that live off the larger system and don't give a whole lot back, or if anything at all. And then social orders which are external to that themselves, and which are preyed upon, you could say, by the larger system in various ways, and which tend to get smaller and smaller and live in the forests and get away from things. The people that Jim Scott's model is all about, but which he never discusses because he's got very few examples of them. He never discusses them, in any case. Within these systems, these expansion structures can become incorporated into the larger system as supply zone peripheries. And when they do that, they tend to take on a very interesting social structure, which is extremely common, which I have found in lots of places, and which my wife basically worked on in Central Africa, the Congo Kingdom, by the way, which had a capital, Banza Congo, which sported a population of almost 100,000 people, so they did have big cities. This is in the 15th century, so there's something really important going on there, and which got incorporated into the larger European expansion process via a simple act of traders coming to the coast and trading with local chiefs, who decided that they could do it on their own and broke off their relationships with the central power in the capital. And suddenly you got yourself into a very fragmented situation with increasing warfare and conflict. And that was the beginning of the slave trade, in which 12 million people were exported out of Africa in exchange for European cloth, which replaced local cloth. All right. Now this is a model which connects, you could say, exchange to. Can I do this? Am I gonna do it right? I can open it. I'll find it. I'm not that stupid, even if I'm old. Here they come. I don't know if you can see that, but like I'll go to the bottom. Oh, it didn't come out so well on the copy. All right, a model that looks like this, in which you have connections between lineages which are hierarchical with relationship to one another, but basically exist in a federation. And that form of federation is one which is based on the monopoly that certain groups get over the larger exchange systems. I haven't got the whole thing here, this is just the internal part of it. And interestingly enough, it leads to a specific kind of exchange structure and even a specific kind of kinship structure, which is very widespread. To give you examples of this, these are systems in which you should say prestige goods move down and people move up, usually women, or men move down. It doesn't really matter. The exchange relations are the same. And this is very common throughout Central Africa. It is common throughout all of Indonesia. In fact, until the transformation of Java, which is an interesting kind of transformation, it was also very similar there, but you see it in the outer islands, especially in the eastern part of Indonesia, where you have these kinds of structures, and I don't want to get into the intricacies, although I'd like to, that have to do with sacred objects that come from very far away, and which are controlled by chiefs who then associate it with those things. A little bit like going to Mecca. In fact, in terms of West African societies, this was very common. The goods themselves became associated with the deities. So you have a kind of dualistic structure, which I can't say a whole lot about, but I would like to. Maybe I will, I gotta see if I get stopped or not. But where it takes various forms. And this is the simple model of the Trobriands. And the Trobriands used to be much more hierarchical, they're much less hierarchical, and I should get to my main model. How much time have I got? Chase?
Oh, you've got, being now
8.
6, 7, 9, you've got 3 minutes.
3 minutes, you're kidding.
Yep.
All right, so.
With the punchline here.
All right. So I'm gonna skip all this. What happens to these systems over time? All right, that's what happens to them over time. This is one example of it. Can you read that?
Oh, yeah, too big, print's too big.
Okay.
Print's too big.
All right, this is about different kinds of boundary formations that occur in the transformation process. So I'm now moving to the lower level in relationship to the larger scale phenomena, although this is a pretty large scale thing, and reversing what people have always said about Oceania. Anthropologists grew up with the notion, especially in the 50s and 60s, Marshall Sahlins was part of it, that you go from egalitarian societies to states. And you go from big men to chiefs, and so on and so forth. In archaeological historical terms, Matthew Spriggs has demonstrated this as well, and we've done some work together. It's exactly the other way around. The earliest societies of Oceania are quite stratified, hierarchical, Lapita societies. And they're also quite densely populated. And if you look at the areas today where everything was supposed to have started, New Guinea, so-called big man societies, are not very old. This is the most densely populated part of Oceania, in which you have big men and lots of warfare, and it's impossible to make a hierarchy because the guy around the corner is just as big as you are pretty soon, and there's no way to maintain the hierarchy. And there's no monopoly. Of course, there are interesting variations on that. When the Europeans came to the highlands, some of the earliest people who came, the missionaries, went to the highlands to a place called Melpa, and they described the place as stratified. And what do? Well, we have to build our houses. And so they came up with a load of cowries that they brought up from the coast, and gave them to everybody, and they built their houses, and before you knew it, there were two things that happened. The chieftains disappeared, and the cargo cult started, and the whole society was transformed into something much more egalitarian as a result of the spreading of the wealth around, as they say, which didn't exist before. Before that, there were trade links down to the coast and all the way to China, because there are Chinese pots all over the highlands of New Guinea that nobody ever discusses really, but which the archaeologists know all about. So, big man systems are the result of a devolution, not the beginning of an evolution. And in the way we've tried to look at it, you could say that what really goes on here is that you started with something that looks like a procedure system, which is very common, I say, in Central Africa, in Indonesia, and other places. And what happens to these systems is that they get transformed by their conditions of reproduction in the long run, which leads to, in some cases, big man systems, in other cases, like in Eastern Polynesia, to being cut off from the trade. And what happens then? These chiefdoms become much more theocratic, very much stratified class structures as they get smaller and smaller, you could say, and start to go to war with one another and go to something that looks like a big man activity. They start to have gigantic feasts and intensify agriculture. So compare Tonga, which is an empire which has outliers in Vanuatu and Melanesia with gigantic graves, to Hawaii, which has none of that, and which is smaller and smaller all the time, even though Pat Kirsch has tried to say this is a state. Yeah, it's a state, but it's a state that's going downhill, and it is basically a stratification process that is the result of internal pressure being put on the fact that it's impossible to maintain power. And they get increasingly theocratic because they can't maintain power. And that's where I get to my dualism part, and I'm leaving that out because it would take too long. These societies go from a dualistic kind of structure with diarchy, where you have priests and chiefs, or priest-chiefs and political chiefs, to one in which there's only one chief, who eats the other one, you could say. And the whole ritual of power is about sacrifice, and about human sacrifice, in Hawaii at least, where you basically eat the other side of the dual structure, as part of a ritual of consuming all power into yourself. So, all right, what's the point of this? Is that you have a certain system that over time transforms itself in several different directions, and those directions produce what we call ethnography. And people go out and look at these places, and they treat them as separate processes, when in fact they are very much part of a larger, you could say, global systemic process, which leads to the formation of new boundaries. So the smaller societies, which are also the densest societies in this system, are the oldest ones, in fact, which are the ones which devolved, you could say, because of internal, you could say, divisiveness. And in the case of Melanesia, the problem there is that it's impossible to monopolize the trade. Whereas in Western Polynesia, you could keep it up. And it kept up for quite a long time. So Tonga was the so-called friendly islands, like China, you could say, even though they were very vicious. And Europeans came, they called them the friendly islands, and they seemed to be very peaceful, no intensive agriculture, and a gigantic network of political hierarchy, you could say, focused on the Tuitonga, who is the king, and his counterpart on the dual side. They maintained the dualism as well, but really all over the place. Compared to Melanesia, where things get smaller and smaller and more intensive, and they also have a very, very intensive agriculture, very developed in most of, let's say, highland New Guinea. Although southern Melanesia, which is interesting, is a little bit more like Western Polynesia. I don't want to talk about that. And then you go to the east, where things went in a different direction, which I call theocratic feudalism, which is based on warfare and expansion, and ultimately decline. So if you compare Hawaii as an example that, even according to Pat Kirsch, is going down at the time of the arrival of the Europeans, that's to say that political units are getting smaller, and if you compare that to some other areas in Eastern Polynesia, like the Marquesas looks like New Guinea in many ways. The chiefs are basically just big men. And that is part of this political decline as a result of intensification of a system in which monopolies disappear. So
Okay.